You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
This is the Daniel Monday Night Community Show on demand through YouTube. Thank you very much for choosing to listen to us through this method. If you'd like to keep up to date with when I add new interviews, then subscribe to this channel. And we're now going to be joined live in the studio with Jim. And Jim is the first of our free sound artists for Arts Transmission. Jim's going to be working with the Sittingbourne Kemsley Light Railway. He's already started. So this evening we've got him here to have a little bit of an introduction all about him, how he's going to be working with the railway, and I think he's going to be talking a little bit about sound art as well. But before we do that, Jim, it's great to have you here at BRFM.
Hello, Daniel. Hello, everyone. It's fantastic to make it down here. What a great place this is, up on the windy cliffs.
Well, it's known as Windy Ridge. So,
Windy Ridge, I'm sure it lives up to that name.
Well, I was wondering, Jim, if you could give us a little bit of an introduction, tell our listeners what sound art actually is.
Sound art, well, it's an umbrella term for a lot of different disciplines and practices, Daniel. So, if you like, supposing you take a term like gardening. If I was to say gardening to you, you might think it's planting gardenias or digging the soil or putting up fences. It can cover a lot of ground. The same with sound art. There's a great many disciplines involved. So, for instance, it includes things such as electronic music, acoustics, which is a kind of scientific study of sound waves, something like psychoacoustics, which is about the way we hear things. So, for instance, the human ear, we hear things in a certain way. If you were to take an owl, for instance, owls have ears that can rotate, and they're able to position mice and things in a far better way than we could.
At the moment, we're talking a little bit about what sound art actually is, which is something we haven't covered, I don't think, on the airwaves here at BRFM. So it's good to hear you talking about it, Jim.
Yeah, well, essentially, Daniel, I was wondering if, it's a new art form to some of your listeners. It's probably nice to explain a little bit about its history. It's actually got quite a short history, the term sound art. It comes from an exhibition in America, I think in 83, 84, with people like Pauline Oliveros and Nick Collins were involved, who are quite well-known practitioners. And I think the curator came up with this term sound art to cover really, as I was saying a moment ago, a very, very wide range of approaches to sound. A very simple definition I'd give you is sound art is a form of art which is directed towards the ear more than the eye. That's not to say it's exclusively directed towards the ear. Some work includes visuals, but you could say it will favour the ear. Now, in terms of sort of scope and stuff, it's a label that some people say is a bit too broad. There's so many approaches you can take that it seeks to contain everything. So it's a little bit sort of flaky as a sort of label. But I think it sort of suggests that really you're dealing with an art form that, as I say, is addressing hearing. Now, when I was saying about psychoacoustics and perception there's many strange aspects to our hearing, because quite often we just take it for granted that we hear a sound and it's a sound created in the real world, and the way we hear it's very sort of accurate and factual. But in truth, there's some very peculiar sides to our sort of hearing. For instance, there are things like MP3s, which are a way of compressing a lot of data in a sound. And this works on the fact that our hearing has this masking effect. Now, have you ever been in a situation where you've been standing next to a busy road and someone's been trying to gain your attention, like a friend sees you, but there's all these cars rushing past and lorries, and you can't hear a thing they're saying, even though they're shouting your name in the distance? Yep. This is known as a masking effect, and for instance, it's one of these kind of aspects of our perception, the way our brain works, because obviously there's a physical side to our hearing. We have our ears and eardrums, which respond to sound waves moving, it's moving air air refracting and compressing, moving. But when it reaches our brains, some rather unusual things have to happen. We have to change that, what's essentially a mechanical energy, into neural energy and electricity in our brains. And within that, there's some quite odd effects. I mean, they've been documented through various kind of acoustic experiments through time. So I hear, what I'm saying essentially, our hearing isn't always truthful.
Well, I was going to say, I did see something, I don't know if it's going slightly off track, but I did see a programme that talked about how we visually see things, and like if you do a drive 5 days a week to work, and sometimes they can suddenly a shop front, a change, or a building to get pulled down, you don't actually see it because your mind will often fill in the blanks because you're not seeing everything. And I suppose that could be the same with hearing in a way.
It is very much the way, Daniel. I mean, something else that always intrigues me, I'm probably going a little bit off the kind of edge here, but I've often wondered if you could take some Stone Age people and miraculously move them forward in time, how they would cope with our current contemporary sound environment. I mean, the idea of what is loud must have changed so much over time, and I can imagine how the world 2,000 years ago was probably relatively silent. It was like a quiet night by comparison. Probably the loudest thing you'd hear is somebody shouting. Whereas today, if you could transport people from the Stone Age into a banging club where there was music thumping out, they'd probably, how do you think they'd feel?
Well, I don't know. I was thinking that actually you don't very rarely these days hear full silence. I was thinking, sometimes when you get a power cut and suddenly the house sounds silent, and it makes you think, well, actually these days probably it's very rare that there isn't some sort of noise in the background, whether it's a fridge running or a radio or telly, or you're in the car and there's the road noise. It's probably actually very rare that you do actually have complete silence.
Well, there's a famous story about the artist John Cage, who did a lot of art, music and sound experiments, and he's a composer who's famous for writing the piano piece 433, and this was actually where a performer goes onto the stage, there's a grand piano, the spotlights, wearing his tails, or she's wearing her evening black, sits down at the piano, opens the lid, opens the music, and then sits there for 4 minutes 33 in complete silence. And the whole idea of this piece was that you would listen to your environment, take in the sounds around you. Now, John Cage had this experience where he was taken to a special form of quiet chamber, and it's known as an anechoic chamber. And they're used a lot in sound testing because an anechoic chamber is an incredibly well-insulated scientific space where no sound can penetrate. And there's all soundproofing, just as you might have in a sound studio to absorb the sound. This place is completely absorbent, so you don't hear any traffic rumble, any jets going overhead. You go in there and it is effectively completely silent. And John Cage went in wanting to experience complete silence and stood in this place, and he was aware of this loud humming noise and this buzzing, and he's thinking, what's wrong? This is supposed to be a silent space. There's all this buzzing and there's humming, and then he realized it was his nervous system. So as far as we go as human beings, we're kind of, even in the quietest space, we're quite noisy things.
While Jim was talking just a minute ago, I was thinking, I suppose really, in some ways we're experiencing sound art without even realising it in that context, I suppose. So like when we watch movies, and if you've got a surround sound or even a normal telly with stereo speakers, you're getting all those sort of effects in the background of the movie. And is that sound art in some kind of way?
Probably not with specific intention, Daniel, but I think the sometimes you'll have like a film soundtrack which can be listened to without the film. So if you take the films of David Lynch, for example, a film of his from the 80s called Eraserhead has a very, very interesting and listenable soundtrack, and if you remove the visuals, it can create whole other pictures in your head. But I think in general usage, sound art does concern an arts practice as opposed to a general commercial practice of making films and music and movies, and that's probably given by its kind of areas. But there are some peculiar crossovers there. There's one of the sort of practices that falls under the umbrella of sound art is something known as acousmatics, and it's a very fancy word, but it comes from a Greek word, and it goes all the way back to the days of the Greek mathematician Pythagoras. And Pythagoras had this great idea for his young students, the ones who just come on board. For 5 years, this guy, how kind is this? He'd make them sit behind a curtain. They weren't allowed to see him. They were only allowed to listen to his lectures. And this word acousmatics was the name in ancient Greek, roughly, given to these students. Now, if you move on in time, there was a form of music developed in France by a guy called Pierre Henry. And him and this other guy, a writer called Peño, came up with this term. They reinvented this term, acousmatics, for music that wouldn't have any visual equivalents. So what I mean by that is that it was purely concerned with the sounds themselves, and they thought that you could develop a form of listening where you could listen to some composed music, and at the time they were working with, originally he worked using discs, and then with an older technology, tape, to create his sound pieces. And the idea was that you could, through practice, through this reductive listening, you could develop an ability to just listen to these sounds without any visual associations. This has since been discredited, but nevertheless, there is this idea there that a sound can have an equal importance without any visual cues. I think in his extreme case, it was probably wishful thinking. Pierre Henry was saying you could perhaps use the sound of a train in a sound art piece, so take it out of its context of being a train and just regard it as a pure set of sounds, the sound of that locomotive, the steam pushing through the cylinders, the wheels going round, the wheels grinding on the track, the rattle of the carriages. You could deal with it purely as a sound phenomena without any associations through sort of training. But I think you do end up with a point where there's always some visual or what we call a gestural association with the sound.
Yeah, well, I was thinking that, I suppose with, when I think about sound art, it can be about creating a different experience. So, if you've got an empty room and I suppose you play the right sort of music, you could actually become quite frightened, but with a nice relaxing music, you could sit down and enjoy that same space. So it can change the whole environment sound.
But almost certainly, I think you can also play with people's perceptions. There was a really wonderful piece by quite a famous sound artist called Janet Cardiff. He's very well known for having pieces placed around the world. And in London, in the Whitechapel Library, for a number of years, you could go in and leave a passport or some document, and they would issue with a CD player and a pair of headphones, and her sound piece was recorded on these special microphones, which are called binaural microphones. Now, these have a sort of character, Dan. They're usually set up around a thing called a dummy head, and if you see this, it actually looks like the kind of heads you might get in a kind of storeroom with models and stuff, just this kind of polystyrene head. But it's actually made out of a special material, and what they do is they place a microphone on each ear on this dummy head, and then if you carry this around, you can do a special recording which really models the way we hear sound, because one of the ways in which we position sounds in space is through time delays and through a thing called shading, and that's actually the effect the shape of our head has on when sounds arrive at each ear. So for instance, if I was to say, ooh, how do I know that there's someone standing to my left talking to me? If I've got, just presuming I've got perfectly good hearing, the sound would probably arrive at my left ear slightly before the right ear, although it's frequency dependent, depends on the frequencies of the sound. But you get this positional information. Now, if you're coming back to these binaural mics, they record this very, very exactly. So when you listen to sound through them, not only do you get a sort of a left and right effect, and I guess everyone who's ever put on a pair of headphones, most people will know the effect of, say, listening to some music where perhaps one of the instruments appears on one channel, or if you're listening to a radio drama, maybe one voice would be slightly pushed to one side. And, you know, I'm not sure, how are we positioned at the moment? Are we both in mono at the moment?
As far as I know, yes. Yeah, although our music is in stereo, our mics come through both speakers.
Yeah. Is it possible, Daniel, for us to be panned either side at the moment on your desk, just momentarily? I'm just wondering if we could do that. Would it create problems?
Possibly you can. Yeah, there we are. If you found
that's the panning control. If you pan us hard left and right. Now, anybody who's listening in a car stereo or in their cars or with headphones, they're probably now hearing me. What side am I on there? On the left?
Yeah, you're on the left, and I should be coming through the right, which sounds like that in my headphones.
It sounds like your headphones. What if you reverse it now? What happens?
Yep, that is reversed.
And how's that? So now we've switched ears, haven't we?
Yes.
So this is the kind of, this is the artificial nature of panning these sounds, and perhaps it's time to go back to mono before we disturb anybody else. Now, with these binaural microphones, they produce this much more realistic effect. It's quite amazing. So what Janet Cardiff did was she recorded a journey, leaving the library, walking through the streets of Whitechapel. She took this kind of tour, past a few historical buildings, past some of the shops. Oops, sorry, I banged your mic there. Past some of the shops. And the idea was that you would follow in her footsteps, listening to this sound piece. And by regulating your steps, you could stand exactly where she was standing. And there was all these ghost images of sound. So, for instance, when you came to cross a road, when she was crossing the road, maybe there was a kind of car thundering past, and this ghost car would appear in your ears, and it's like completely disorienting, this effect, like you suddenly start wandering, turning your head, you're hearing these sounds, and you lose your connection with reality. It really sounded as though you were in sort of two spaces at once. It's quite, it's quite incredible. So it's just an example of playing with sounds and perception there, Daniel.
And that was what I was hoping we could talk a little bit about, is about how you're working with the railway.
Well, Daniel, these are early days. The first thing I wanted to do, I should explain, this is a very specific application of sound art. And for me, it really is a dream invitation to come down and work with a local group like this. The SKLR have got a fantastic rich history, absolutely stunning, this industrial railway that has survived intact from 1905 or something, when they started construction. So for a sound artist, you can imagine steam railways, diesel trains, working on these engines, all the surrounding sounds, the area, local sounds. There's the estuary. It's just so dripping in associations and richness. The history comes through. So in terms of it being early days, I've come down with not preconceptions. I see my job as coming in first of all and just listening and using my ears to discover what the railway's all about. It's been a real eye-opener, actually. Something I didn't realise to the degree which has really stunned me is this is a project completely peopled by volunteers and by goodwill, which is actually overflowing in the place. And coming down there, it's been very nice that you've come along as well. Simon Martin, the photographer, who's doing excellent work documenting every stage of the project and bringing his skills to the project as well. He's come along. We've been to this site and people have bent over backwards Liz and Bob and all the team to make us welcome and show us around. Now,
yeah, well, it's I was going to say it's an amazing place. I've been interviewing Paul Best, so our listeners are familiar with, probably since we launched 7 years ago at the station, and they've always made me feel welcome when I've come down. So when we were conceiving this project, when I was conceiving it with Laura and Louise, they were one of the people I thought of, because it had all the sound, the history, the people.
Yeah, well, absolutely, Dan. I mean, it's an inspired choice, and of course it's a kind of golden gem, set in the local community, and the fact they've been able to maintain the site, and I've recently sort of learnt that the future of the railway is sort of intact for the time being, which is just marvellous news. To think this incredible operation can continue forward. Now, in terms of sound art, I think my initial job, like I say, is to come in and listen. So I've really been coming down and trying to soak up the atmosphere of the place, getting to know people. Before Christmas, one of the things that's perhaps a little bit sad for me in some ways as a sound artist is that this being the season of freezing water and terrible weather generally, as we've been experiencing this freaky weather, understandably there's a sort of downtime for the engines. I mean, they need a lot of servicing, a lot of work, and remember, these are volunteers and there's limited time to sort of work on these engines, and there's quite it's quite a lot of work. I mean, health and safety considerations, these great big boilers. As one of the train engineers explained to me, when very generously I got a ride in the train cab, which was just a phenomenal experience, I must say. He was saying, basically, very calmly, he said this to me, I was sitting in front of this roaring furnace with steam gushing past my ears, holding a microphone. And he said, essentially this engine is a huge bomb, which any moment could go off, which kind of terrified the life out of me. Because it's true, but these people are well in control of these marvellous machines. So I don't know, it's just really fantastic opportunity. I raced down on a number of occasions before Christmas, because at that time of year, there's especially for families and for children go absolutely mad for this. They run what's called the Santa Specials, and this is during the month of December they do these journeys, and like I say, it's a family-based thing. So you buy a ticket and you set off at Sittingbourne End, ride this magical train ride across the viaduct all the way into Kemsley Down, where the major SKLR operation is based, and the kids go off and to Santo's grotto, which is set up, and there's also a Mother Christmas, which they had readings. The adults get a chance to mingle in the very friendly cafe and enjoy meals and teas and stuff like that. A welcome respite from the cold that time of year. So this was my opportunity to record the steam trains. So what can I say? I made the most of it. So my first point of contact was focusing on just trying to capture as much of the trains as I could. And I've got to say, the SKLR people were so accommodating. I got to ride in various carriages. I got 2 engine rides, sitting on the sort of plate with the fireman and the driver. I got a full explanation of the workings. I'm afraid quite a lot of it went over my head, not being very well up on steam operations. But I can tell you, these machines are absolutely fascinating when you think about their age and the sort of technology and the handcrafted beauty of these things. There's so much art and craft in these sort of engines. The design, the look, it's just so iconic and beautiful.
Jim is our sound artist for Arts Transmission, and he's working with the Sittingbourne Kemsley Light Railway, and that's what we're talking all about at the moment.
Yeah, I was just wanted to move on to say, Daniel, that there was what a surprise it was to me to see the scale of the operation and get an idea of just how much is involved. As it's been explained to me, the maintenance of the sort of engines, not just the operation, but sort of keeping these things on the road. I mean, they're classic engines. You know, you've got engines going back to 1905. You know, they're not just precious pieces of kit, but they're also working machines that need sort of looking after. Beyond that, there's all the other aspects. There's the organisational aspects of the sort of railway. There's the archiving aspects. We met Liz the other day at the station, and who is part of running the CAF along with Bob. And she spends a lot of time researching the history. It's such a rich history. And again, that's something that's so attractive to me as a project, is doing community-based work, which I'm really sort of attracted to, because a lot of my work involves using the human voice and people's experiences and their lives, really, the richness of that. I often think contained within a voice itself, you get a real sense of richness about somebody's life. I mean, we all have experiences as we go along. It all adds together, builds into this incredible picture. It can remain sort of hidden. I think there's a side where people can undervalue these incredible things they do. And coming in as an outsider, I mean, I've been absolutely amazed. I mean, just sort of something like running the sort of CAF on this site. I mean, as you know, the Kemsley Down site, where they're sort of based, it's actually a sort of difficult site to sort of access, because, I mean, you know, with great kindness, the mill has supported the railway operation, but you know, there are security concerns there, as I'm sure you know, Daniel, in that you've got this giant, one of these largest paper mills in Europe, full of this highly flammable stuff known as paper and card, you know. So obviously you have to be very careful about the sort of site, and the only access to Kemsley Down is through the sort of mill, but they're very, very sort of accommodating in that sense. And despite this, what must be a great difficulty, an operational difficulty, there at the Kemsley Down site, you've got all these engines. I mean, they've got an absolutely mind-blowing collection of stuff, you know. And to me, as a sound artist, I'm looking at that, and, you know, when you mix in people's experiences and the richness of voices and all the sort of current contemporary activities, you know, the organisational things. For instance, I met Jacqueline when I was down recording one day, and she was telling me, she does the rotors, Jacqueline, for the station. She was telling me that there's like 80 volunteers coming from, I mean, she comes from Brighton, you know, people come in from outside the area who love the sort of station, you know, come in, give their time, their expertise. You know, I marvel at how we've had this, you know, when did the steam age end? Probably the end of the 60s, essentially, you know. People moved over to diesel and electrify the railways. And yet this knowledge has been, like a furnace, has been kept burning, this amazing sort of knowledge. And, you know, these are all aspects that, at the moment, I'm sort of cooking all of this amazing stuff in my head, along with, as I described, the unimaginable sound worlds of the railway. I mean, and as I say, it's not... The steam is very attractive because it's such an iconic sound, the chuff-chuff and the chugging and the railway working hard or easing down the line, you know, as it sort of comes into a sort of downhill gradient, these changes in sound, the magnificent cacophony of these carriages when you sit inside them. I mean, I come up from London riding the rather recent HS1, which is this very smooth, susurrating, hissing railway, you know, with all electronic mod cons. It's very quiet in there. And then you suddenly climb on board an SKLR carriage, and there's all sort of clacking and metal and banging. It's the most rich sort of sound experience. So, yeah, at this stage, I'm just loving the experience. And as I say, in my head, all these elements are cooking along, and I just can't wait to get back to the railway and get chatting. And, you know, there's a process there that essentially I'm not someone who, as an artist, I don't come into a situation with a lot of preconceptions and the idea, oh, we're going to do this, or I want to do that, or I'd like it to be this. my working method is very much coming in and listening and trying to work out what is the actual essence of particular situation, and there is nothing as rich as a community situation. A living community situation for me is the richest of experiences.
So I was wondering, talking about how are you going to capture the railway through sound, and what sort of equipment do you use? How do you do it in that sort of context?
Well, equipment, it's fairly straightforward. I have a kind of range of microphones that I can employ, Daniel. So it depends on the circumstance. If you're recording outdoors, probably the greatest enemy to getting a usable recording, a clean recording, if you like, an uncoloured recording, is, believe it or not, the wind itself. Because microphones, unlike our ears, are very, very sensitive to wind movement and wind pressures. So you get this, can I demonstrate this horrible noise you get? I don't want to damage your mic, but you kind sort of noise continually if you're standing with an unguarded microphone. So if you've ever seen TV reporters and people wandering around microphones, they're normally carrying this very elliptical, zeppelin-shaped hairy animal that is known as a dead cat. And the method we use is we have a very directional microphone. These are special microphones. They're quite long. They're also known rather aggressively as rifle microphones, probably because of the sort of shape. And you put that inside of a special housing, which is this, like I say, is a elliptical zeppelin-shaped object. And then around that, sort of deaden the sort of effect of the wind, you put this fluffy monster. It looks like a sort of kid's fluffy toy, basically, and it's known as a dead cat, unless you happen to be in Australia, where it's called a dead wombat.
And we're talking all about how you're going to be capturing that and the kind of equipment you use.
Yeah, well, coming back to my microphone, once you've dealt with the problems with the wind, Daniel, the recordists and anyone who does recording will tell you the wind is a hell of a problem. Once you've got past the wind interfering, because obviously if you want to get a sound, you'd like to have that sound on its own. So when you're surrounded by lots of sounds, let me give you an example. Supposing you're a nature lover and you're out there in the reeds trying to capture this very rare bird. This rare bird has flown across from the Urals and appeared on our shores for the first time. It's hiding in the reeds, but also in the reeds are 2,000 other birds. They're all having a sing-song, and you're trying to capture this particular bird. So in terms of equipment, that's when these rifle microphones are very useful. I mean, you can even go so far, when I say they're useful, they're very directional, so they're good for just picking out a very narrow area of sound. So what they'll do is they'll ignore the birds to the side and maybe just pick up the ones directly in front, maybe a little bit behind. But you can also add some other kit. There's a thing known as a parabola, which looks like a small umbrella, and some sound recordists like to use that because what that does is it bounces any sound coming in, it focuses it back onto the mic, and essentially the mic gets even more directional. So if you were out there in the reeds, and this, I'm not too up on bird watching, I know certain species and sounds, but let's just say this is a very rare bird we've forgotten the name of. You could capture that sort of quite exactly. So some of my kit's like that. I've got very directional microphones for working outdoors, which is very useful. Like the other day, I came down, like I said, before Christmas, and the rain it was unbelievable. I was out there and I've got all this sensitive electronic stuff. And we know how bad the weather's been lately. And there's this driving rain coming down. Simon, the photographer, can vouch for this. We were both soaking wet. We were both worried about our equipment dying, and there's sort of rain bouncing off everything. And then very kindly, they let me go down the track, and I was handed a sort of high-vis jacket to keep me safe, and I wandered down the track in all this rain, and what I wanted to get, Daniel, was a sort of pure recording of Superb, the engine that was drawing the carriages that day. Superb chugging up the tracks from the distance, going past me and going, and that is like the classic train sound, the coming and going. It's so evocative. So I stood there at the side of the track with this rain. The rain's pouring off the branches. I was like soaking wet, and what appears, in the distance, I could just hear the arrival of the train, and next thing, a stonking great jet engine appears. But with my mic, this directional mic, I was able to sort of minimise the effects, because obviously the train doesn't run so often, but there's like 4 journeys, is it, a day when they do the Santa specials?
Yeah, probably something like that.
4 or 5. So what that means is there's only so many opportunities. And like I say, the trouble was this day it was so wet, my equipment was, it's about to die, basically. There's so much rain coming in. My dead cat covering my microphone was soaking wet, For myself, I'm not too worried. I'm kind of all weathers, but when you've got sensitive equipment, you have to worry about it. So I'll talk a bit more about the sort of stuff I've got. For working outdoors, I've got what we call a field recorder. So it's a very tough, hard-wearing, robust digital recorder. The one I've got records at very, very high quality. It records at a very high frequency, which is good. It's good for me because another one of these areas that interacts with sound art is a sound discipline which just deals with the acoustics of wildlife, and indeed the sounds that humans make, but also the sounds that all sort of animals make. So into that mix we might include the bats and creatures, insects that generate sounds that our ears can't even pick up. I mean, we're all familiar with bat clicking, and probably seen wildlife programs where they record these sounds of the bats and slow them down, and suddenly the inaudible, what we can't hear, becomes audible. We can suddenly hear these bats out hunting for moths and small flying insects at night, and they're making these very sharp directional clicking sounds that bounce off their prey and come back. And of course the bats have got these fabulous hearing, these amazingly complex ears. If you get a chance, it's probably not the prettiest sight in the world to some people, but if you look at the complexity of a bat's ear, it's really very sort of architectural, beautifully shaped thing. So I've got a particular recorder that can really capture lots of high frequencies, because I do a lot of processing on my sounds, Daniel, so using software, so obvious what we call manipulations, changing the nature of the sound, slowing it down, speeding it up. So for me it's very interesting. I might find when I slow a recording down that this whole new range of sounds appear that I didn't even know was there. So this is the benefits of using stuff which got a very wide bandwidth, which can capture lots of frequencies.
So there's only so much you can really tell of what you're getting when you're there, and then it's a case of taking it back to the studio and seeing what you've actually got and what is actually usable.
Yeah, it's a case. I mean, one of the interesting things about what they call bioacoustics and working in recording those areas is that as an application, they found that they can discover new species of creatures who live in high density vegetation, things you'd never see, insects and stuff. So these can become like a tool for revealing stuff, but also these recordings can be used artistically. So for instance, something people probably don't consider very often are the sounds of the sea. And again, if you go online, it's really interesting to go and do this. You go online and you'll find recordings of fish farting and these sounds carrying, and water changes the actual physics of sound. It moves at a completely different speed than it does through air. And one of the phenomena of this is that sound can carry great differences. And in environmental terms, there's a lot of concerns about this, because if you went back, say, before the age of engines, even with sailing ships and stuff, the sea was probably a relatively quiet place for the creatures that live there and rely on communication, long-range communication, whales and dolphins and things. But since the coming of engines and submarines and things, and oil machines and trawlers, the sea's become a very noisy place, you know. And this is a man-made event that's only occurred in a very, very, if you take the whole of history in the sea, the time it's been there and the time there's been living creatures in the sea, for this infinitesimally small amount of time, people have come along and started generating very loud, unusual sounds. And these, you know, these can be considered as a form of environmental pollution and stuff. So I think it's nice to work the other way and work with these sort of animal sounds. And, you know, it obviously depends on the piece you're working in, but it's nice to explore the entire soundscape of the world.
So do you always use digital recorders? 'Cause I was thinking our photographer, he uses a digital camera, but he also likes to use the traditional film camera. And do you always record with modern digital, or do you use older equipment to still record on tape?
Well, I do a lot of experimenting, you know, just for the hell of it, and looking at things. And I've got tape recorders. Obviously, there's a thing of expediency there and having time on your hands. So all media have, if you like, their own sort of characteristics. And you might be somebody who finds listening to vinyl like the most beautiful thing in the world, and listening to a data-reduced, compressed MP3 to be the most horrible thing going. Or you might be somebody who doesn't really notice the difference. But I tend to think that these characteristics of media are quite important, and certainly within certain practices in sound art, people do works that is related to probably minimalist art practices, where you foreground the nature of the material, the form of the material rather than, the content of the material rather than the form. Similarly with, you know, works where you have experimental film works. There's an art practice in film known as structuralist film, which was very, very strongly evident in the UK in the 60s and 70s. And really this dealt with the medium of projecting and the film itself, rather than the actual sort of content of narrative and stories and pictures. They were interested in the mechanism of projecting. So you might, for instance, have flicker films by Tony Conrad, which were purely made up of frames of black and white, which are, you know, very beautiful to experience, those films. In a similar way, you get sound works that might just work with the nature of vinyl itself, of recording onto vinyl with adding no audio, just putting a needle in a groove with the silence and hearing the actual sound that a record will make. I mean, anyone who remembers vinyl will probably be well familiar with the amount of clicking and surface noise and the effects of a warped record, the needle sort of rising and falling. Similarly with sort of tape could have its own sort of characteristics, and you might, for instance, have tape that got stretched, so the playback speed would vary, or there's a device in a tape player known as a capstan that controls the speed, and these could wear with time, and as the tape went through it would sort of slip. And these are all analog technologies, basically, as opposed to sort of digital, and they kind of reveal their own shortcomings and artifacts, and those shortcomings and their own identities as media is again something you can play with.
And I know you want to talk a little bit about the airing, I think your experiences as well.
Yeah, well, it's I had a great day today, Daniel, because it was my first visit ever, I'm ashamed to say, to the Isle of Sheppey. I've never been here before. Now, I've got a very, very good friend who lives in Spain, who grew up here, guy called Richard, and he's told me an awful lot about various areas here. Is it true, Daniel, there's a crockery beach on Sheppey?
There might be. I don't know. I don't think I've ever heard of that.
A crockery beach, somewhere covered in broken china and stuff?
I always think of Shell Nest. I mean, that's down in Laysdown. That's like all shells.
It's all shell. Oh, maybe that's
That could be it, possibly.
He described. Maybe it was a childhood memory of his. Now, something that's kind of interesting for me is when you come into an area and you start to get unexpected connections. Now, I came down here today and we visited Sheppey and Sheerness. We're walking along the beach, and it was a lovely sunny day. Actually, it was very enjoyable. Sea was very quiet. I was interested to hear, using my ears, listening my way around. And then we set off for Faversham because my partner Mary's aunt's in a residential home there, and her name's Jean Kenwood, and so it was great to come up and visit her and experience the town and walking around, because, as I say, I'm getting to know this area and getting a feel for it and sort of feeling my way in. It's all part, for me, it's all part of the project, getting to know the way it sort of works and fits together. And visiting there, we're chatting to Jean, and she said, oh, what are you up to? And I was describing the project and working with SKLR. And when I said SKLR, her ears pricked up. And, she's quite an old lady, but she's very sharp still. She sort of said, SKLR? She said, is that the light railway that is in Sittingbourne? I said, oh, yeah, you've heard about it. She said, the lady 2 doors along, her son comes to visit. And what's his name? She was saying his name's Rollo or something. I don't know his surname. But anyway, apparently Jean's friend 2 doors along, her son is one of the volunteers on the sort of railway. So I was quite amazed that coming into this area, there's this connection with the project, instantly this connection, Daniel, was quite lovely, So I thought, because of that, Jean is going to find out for me who this gentleman is, because I'm curious to sort of know. It could be somebody I've already met. I don't know. So I thought, in honour of that, seeing as we're dealing with sound, it's slightly off the mark, but is it okay if I read one of Jean's poems?
Yeah, it's fine.
Right, because she's a published poet, Jean. This is a very nice haiku that she wrote in the Japanese form, and it's called Spring Haiku. Shall I take it away? Turbulent with birds, the rain's bead curtain loosens canticles of light. White hawthorn blossoms thicken the teeming hedges, pretending snowfall. Coming and going, moths on their vagrant journey grapple with darkness. A young moon rises, immaculate in silver, sweetening the night. So I was getting a bit Christopher Lee at the end there, wasn't I?
No, it's fine. So, before we go, was there anything else you wanted to cover briefly?
Well, just that I just really want to say how wonderful it is to be here, Daniel, and to visit, and it'd be lovely to come back and talk some more about the project, if that's possible.
No, like that. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely, that's great. Well, beyond saying how amazing this studio is, I mean, what a setup you've got up here. It's like such a beautiful and friendly and professional setup. I'm quite amazed. Fantastic station. I mean, it's like a dream, this place. And I'd love to come here in the day and see some of these wonderful views from the cliff. It sounds like something that needs to be experienced. Yeah. Now, one last thing I've got here is just, as you might have guessed, a website where I will shortly, there's nothing there yet, but very shortly, be placing some of the sounds I've been recording as a sort of audio diary and works in process. I mean, as you said, there are other websites that you've set up, Flickr sites and your blog, and I hope people will take the time to have a look. It's very interesting, Daniel's blog, and from there we can access lots of interviews and programs that you do covering the community. So That's great. Well, here's this website then. It's would you like to read it out, Daniel? Because you've got that fantastic radio voice.
No, you do, because it's your site. So,
Oh, all right then. Okay. Well, it's soundcloud.com/tons of steam. And tons of steam is all one word.
Well, Jim, I'd like to thank you very much for coming along this evening and talking all about sound art and giving our listeners a chance to hear from you and be introduced to you. And, of course, we look forward to talking to you over the next few months as the project progresses as well.
Yeah, I'll look forward to it too, Daniel. It's been absolutely a joy to be here. Thank you very much.
That is Jim this evening, and Jim is one of 3 sound artists that we've commissioned as part of Arts Transmission, which is the project to make new sound art for the airwaves here at BRFM Bridge Radio through the Daniel Monday Night Community Show. You can find out all about the project on our website, brfm.net. If you go to the articles page, one of the articles is an Arts Transmission article, and it talks all about the project. There's a link there to the Arts Transmission website. You can go directly to it by going to www.artstransmissionradioexperiment.wordpress.com.